Good afternoon. Welcome to this Bright Blue Spring Forum event on supporting communities during the pandemic, Charities and Covid-19, in partnership with the People's Postcode Lottery. I'm Phoebe Arsenagic-Wakefield, researcher at Bright Blue, which is an independent, liberal conservative think tank. Our research focuses on domestic, social, economic and environmental policy. The pandemic has posed a significant challenge for British charities. In 2020, the government provided a £750 million funding package for the charity sector, and some of the government's Culture Recovery Fund will also be directed to charities. But was it enough? Over the past year, charities have experienced a difficult trend of increases in demand for their services, but a reduction in income, with some having to rely on donations to fund contracted work. Our excellent panelists, who I will shortly introduce, will be discussing the challenges the sector faces, how we can make it easier for charities to fundraise, and what the long-term impact of COVID will be for them. Afterward, I'll get the discussion going and put your questions to the panelists in the Q&A section of this event. You can submit questions throughout the event. If you are watching through the Spring Forum platform, then please use the Q&A button to do so. And if you're watching via YouTube, then please use the Slido link, entering the code above this link. You can also ask us questions and tweet your thoughts during the event via Twitter using the hashtag #BrightBlue. So I'm now going to introduce our excellent panelists, and then afterwards they will each speak for 5 minutes on their perspective and priorities in terms of supporting charities through COVID-19. So Danny Kruger MP, who will be joining us shortly, was elected to represent Devizes in 2019, and before that was Political Secretary to Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Catherine Johnston, CBE, is Chief Executive of the Royal Voluntary Service, before which she was Chief Executive Samaritans. Tim Montgomery is a British political activist, blogger and columnist. Mike Adamson is the Chief Executive of the British Red Cross, and Malcolm Fleming is Head of Public Affairs at the People's Postcode Lottery. So, Catherine, would you like to kick us off?
Yes, thank you, Phoebe. From my perspective, having been at the forefront of the response to the pandemic, I think COVID has been transformational for charities and for civil society. They've stepped up, they've been a vital resource, and Mike from Red Cross is here, but unfortunately Martin from St John's is not. But between the three charities, we've mobilised about 1.2 million, if not 3 million volunteers in support of the state during the pandemic. When I say we've been at the forefront, it's been delivering vital services. So services that were essential and largely through volunteer power and effort. We've been able to do that at pace and scale because we were already rooted in the communities in which we serve. We've all been around for a very long time, and we were already working in partnership with the state, with the NHS and the wider economy. The public response from my perspective, if you want to focus on volunteering, is that it has been amazing to see 12.7 million people step forward to volunteer during this pandemic. About 4.6 million of them volunteered for the first time, and you've seen that across the spectrum, from very informal volunteering, the rise of mutual aid, local food banks, helplines, all the way through right up to big charities like Royal Voluntary Service, British Red Cross, St John's, and others who've mobilised national schemes and delivered them locally. Particularly from my perspective, the NHS Volunteer Responder Scheme, which has now delivered more than 1.6 million tasks to the shielded, utilising about 400,000 volunteers, and again just expanded recently to look at the support for vaccination centres. So of the people that have stepped forward, the research that is being done, and there's quite a lot of research that's being done, is saying that about 75% of those volunteers would be prepared to step forward again, or to continue to step forward as part of recovery, or to support their local communities with other volunteering opportunities, now having stepped into that arena. So why does that matter? Well, we're definitely providing the bridge in between the civil society, active citizenship and the state. There's many benefits to this civic participation in building cohesion, building social capital. I'm sure Tom and Mike will talk more about that later. But volunteering is actually good for you. Again, lots and lots of evidence globally that it's good for your physical fitness, it's good for your mental health, it's good for keeping you connected, and it's great for building resilient communities. PPL, hosting this today, have been an amazing funder during this as a society lottery. They have been very flexible. They've provided a lot of unrestricted income, and actually, even if we were recipients pre-COVID, they've allowed us to redirect funding during the pandemic to where the need has been the greatest. And that has been absolutely essential to the way in which Royal Voluntary Service has been able to respond to the pandemic. Because as you can imagine, the fundraising landscape for charities has been pretty decimated. There's lots of innovation going on, lots of digital, lots of appeals. But if you are anyway reliant on event fundraising or any of the other face-to-face fundraising mechanisms, then income has been down, as has ours, because we actually have a very large retail footprint in the NHS, and my 46 million income a year was not there last year because we had to close all of them in order to give the hospitals the space to deal with the pandemic. So just before I finish my short piece, I think for me, I've been on the soapbox in the last sort of month where everybody seems to want to talk about the legacy of the volunteering phenomenon during the pandemic. And actually, I really, really strongly believe that's the wrong lens for us all to be looking through. We have a massive opportunity here with a 12.7 million citizens who step forward, of which 10 million of them are saying they want to carry on. And therefore, we've got to play forward the people that have stepped forward into recovery and into other community opportunities to volunteer. And we've got to find ways of doing that smartly, because once the pandemic is over and people's restrictions are lifted, people will be less likely to step up again. And actually, we want to play this forward. The big prize for all of us is that actually, if those 12.7 million people remain active citizens beyond the pandemic and recovery, we will have massively increased the depth, the breadth, the diversity of our civil society. And that is good for all of us. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Catherine. Danny, welcome. Can I go to you next, please, for your 5-minute speech?
Hello there. Very good to be with you all, and thank you to Bright Blue for organising. I'm really pleased that you guys have done good work over the years on promoting a stronger civil society, and coming from the more socially conservative end of our party, I think this is an area of great common cause across the breadth of conservatism and indeed across politics. We all fundamentally believe in strong communities and a vibrant civil society, and I think this is a great point of, frankly, political opportunity. And I thought I would today frame my remarks quite politically. I talk about this area a lot, and usually to very non-political audiences, and I'm very conscious of not trying to, as it were, acquire or sort of take the civil society agenda from my political tradition. But I do think there's a strong case for Conservatives to lay claim to a civil society agenda, and that does not to preclude other political traditions from doing the same. And in fact, what I want in our politics is an open and friendly contest between our traditions, Liberals, the Labour tradition and the Conservative tradition, about who can best present an offer that strengthens communities, that invigorates civil society, and that develops a vision of our common good. And so I'm going to just talk briefly about what I think has happened through the pandemic, and Catherine's remarks there very much, I echo everything she's been saying. I think we have now an imperative as well as an opportunity to capitalise on the transformation that we've seen in the way people relate to public services and to their neighbours. So what happened, and we've just been hearing about it, is a great flowering of voluntary effort and of community spirit. And to me, that's built on something that was happening already in our culture. And at risk of sounding flippant, I do think there was a sense in which the trend was flowing this way before, and you could see it in all sorts of kind of cultural straws in the wind. There's the increasing attention to the provenance of food. Where's your food come from? Is it local? Is it organic? Is it made sustainably? The way we think about the relation of people to their environments, to their neighbourhoods. We've seen a great cultural, I think of it as a culturally conservative shift back in search of connection and belonging, and the sort of traditional fabrics that used to make up our society. And you literally see it in fashion. People wearing tweed and corduroy and jeans, and going on bicycles and eating slow food, and it's all, and wearing beards. These are cultural shifts which I think were indicative of our general cultural retreat from a soulless technocratic world, and it can happen in parallel with a technocratic world, of course. You can have a beard and an iPhone simultaneously, and in fact the digital revolution is incredibly powerful and important to what we're discussing here. But I'm just, in this rather flippant way, pointing out that there was a shift towards the local, the rooted, the connected in our society anyway, and we've seen that accelerated during the pandemic. So one thing that's happened is this increased attention to neighbourhood and voluntarism, and amazing upsurge we've just been hearing about in people volunteering. The other thing that happened, really encouragingly, is public service reform just happened organically and by default and by necessity, and instigated by frontline workers and by managers in the public sector and in local authorities as well. So traditionally, we've got used to this sense that public services operate in terrible silos, very bureaucratic and slow moving, and they don't work well with wider society, with civil society. Of course, all of that remains true, and we're all very used to the frustrations that people have experienced over the last year with sclerotic bureaucracies. But actually, the frontline experience has been really impressive in the way local authorities, and the NHS in particular, have adapted and flexed and worked with partners. And we see there that I think the outlines of a new settlement, more local, less siloed, more human public services. So those are the phenomena we've seen developing. How do we sustain all of this? Well, I think there's two things that need to happen, and one, as Conservatives, we probably find more comfortable than the other. The comfortable one is what I've just been describing: public service reform. I think now is the time for government to support the trends that have been developing in terms of a more local public sector and a more human social system altogether. And there's a great role for charities and for volunteers and for empowering frontline professionals. And there's loads of work being done on this. Lots of other partners, Bright Blue, have done some really good work on this as well. So I think a new shape of a better public service system is emerging, and I would like to see our party and our government recover the energy around public service reform that is naturally, because of Brexit and COVID, been on the back burner. So I hope that we'll see that. And then the other thing, the second thing we need to do, and this is where I think it's more uncomfortable for Conservatives, is we need a great transfer of power. We need a great democratization of our country. We remain an incredibly centralized state, and we really have to fulfill our walk the walk now. We talk about trusting the people. We talk about our distrust of big government and Whitehall. Well, what that means is not, arbitrarily shrinking the state from the centre. What it means is empowering communities more directly, and that means handing over power and control and responsibility to local places. Partly that's about localism through the local government structure, and I recognise all the anxieties that brings. We think about Liverpool at the moment. So this is not without risk, but we do need to continue to press ahead with devolution in England. But we're all, and beyond big cities, we need to talk about counties and towns as well. But beyond local government, and this is where I really feel the opportunity is, we need to be devolving power and responsibility to communities themselves. And how you do that is through a whole messy system of different sorts of innovations, which are already developing, particularly on the left of politics. And this is where I think, as a party, we need to get over ourselves and adopt some of these methodologies of participatory budgeting, citizens' assemblies, these techniques which put real people in a position of direct influence over the systems and the decision-making that affects their communities. And I will end with this observation. Margaret Thatcher said the facts of life do invariably turn out to be Tory. I think we in our party have an inappropriate lack of faith in the people. And I think, and I believe, that if you trust people, they will make decisions which we as Conservatives would applaud. And we should be brave enough to start trusting them again about local power. And there's a whole bunch of innovations I think we need to adopt to deliver that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Danny. Tim, can we go to you?
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to be with you today. And I'm in danger of echoing a lot of what Danny has just shared with us. I agree with just about everything he said, and I think my remarks hopefully will very much complement what he has said. There's the front page of the newspaper today looks at the some of the leaps forward in medicine that have occurred because of the pandemic. The extra research, that urgent impetus to find solutions to the immediate problem are going to produce all sorts of side effect benefits to the treatment of other illnesses. And this is a general historical pattern. After the Second World War, we saw huge changes because of innovation that was struck up in wartime, not just technologically and scientifically, but organizationally and sociologically as well. Now, a pandemic is not of the same scale, obviously, as a war, but there will be a natural impetus for some significant changes. And I think in some areas, we should definitely be encouraging them. And on that basis, rather than spending this immediate seminar looking at some of the immediate tactical funding and other issues facing the voluntary sector, as important as those might be, I think it's important that we don't waste this opportunity to really do some bigger thinking as to what a new relationship between the state, the voluntary sector, and the market economy, the three big spheres of any developed society, look like. And I don't think we have yet done that. And although Danny is definitely doing this thinking, I don't really see it yet from government. And also, to be direct, I don't see it from the charity and voluntary sector either. With a few exceptions, there doesn't seem that enthusiasm, that boldness to try and think really big and meet the circumstances. So what would it look like then if we were to change things? Well, I think it should look very much like what often is discussed for local government. And this is really where I'm echoing Danny. British local government in Britain has so little independence from central government, a lack of autonomy on its funding, and often its powers are heavily circumscribed, less circumscribed than they were, but still quite circumscribed. And no real place in a constitution so that they know that their powers are sacrosanct and they can't be usurped at any one point by central government. Now, charities in the voluntary sector cannot have exactly the same privileges that you would have for local government. But I think we should be introducing some kind of radical system whereby, through a process of graduation, organizations that exist in the not-for-profit sector, organizations that could come into existence, once they've passed certain tests, have an automatic right to certain privileges as a result. So, first they may just be trusted with access to some facilities. Later they might get money. Later they might get borrowing under writing from the Treasury. And each time they show that they can pass these tests, there becomes almost an automaticity that those privileges will be retained by them. And this has sort of been something I have wanted for a long time, and I realize there will be risk. There will be organizations that grow up in this kind of environment whereby they take unacceptable levels of risk and certain things will go wrong. And I think our society's attitude to risk is a big problem, and we need to be more willing to embrace it. But why I'm willing to take the risk of giving these charitable and other institutions the right to have more independence is what we desperately need in this country, because our communities are so different, because the problems we face are so varied, and every individual, every community is different from another. We need much greater diversity of approach and thinking. And I don't see anywhere near enough diversity of thinking and innovation in the voluntary sector. And I think a large part of that, the absolute driving reason why there is a lack of diversity in the voluntary sector, is a massive recycling of personnel between Whitehall, politics, local government and the charity sector. You've basically got the same people all running these organisations. And that is the very good reason that those people are good at accessing funds, understanding how the state works. And so long as we have a voluntary sector that is far too close to the state, we will have a voluntary sector that exhibits the state's worst problems, which is a desire not for things to go wrong because of the political consequences of that. Voluntary sector, of course, needs the money. So the link between the voluntary sector and the state continues. And so some form of system, and I think the government would be wise to consult on this and not necessarily embrace my back of the envelope recommendation. And perhaps there's a variety of ways of doing it. But a system whereby not-for-profit organisations, by proving that they can deliver, that they use money in just an honest way, first of all, that they have measures of confidence of their local community or the groups that they serve, they become part of they become an institution in their communities and in their sector. And if Conservatives don't want to build new kinds of institutions after crisis like this, then I don't think we're really Conservatives. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Tim. Mike, would you like to go next?
Gauntlet. I'd just like to say I've never worked in Whitehall, but I've had a lot of experience at Whitehall over the last year. I just want to offer reflections in three areas, really. One is about vulnerability and health inequalities and inclusion, and a second is then around collaboration and ways of working, and a third is around innovation. Because as others have implied, we're at a point of inflection. There's a whole bunch that we have an opportunity to look at a set of issues and challenges in quite different ways, and it will be about a choice about the way in which we decide to move forwards. I mean, the first is a question is around health inequalities and inclusion. Be it the death of George Floyd or the death of Sarah Everard, or all the evidence about the differential impact of COVID on BAME communities. It's clear that the way in which we look at society and need is going to change. And we at the Red Cross have been doing things in this response that we haven't done in decades around things like food delivery, working with partners like FareShare, and we've seen a quadrupling in the demand for food banks. And these are inequalities or emergency needs layered on top of existing inequalities. And harrowing stories about from across all of our services here in the UK about people not having enough to eat, not knowing where the next pound is coming from, where getting access to a family, which one of our volunteers told me a story about, who when we delivered a box of food, the child saying, at last my mum will be able to have a cup of tea. These are really harrowing stories in 21st century Britain, and I think we've got to learn from them and think about how we respond at a human level, but also using evidence about where the greatest needs are and how we're going to work differently. And some of the innovation work that we've done is around trying to develop and target the things that we do through using a vulnerability index about where are the postcodes which are likely to have the greatest vulnerability, both in terms of because of economic needs, but also digital exclusion, health issues, and so on, and then making sure that our support is going into those areas. So how we use both our human instincts and all the compassion that organizations across our sector bring to bear, but also using evidence to target where we provide support. I think a second key realization through COVID is around the role of collaboration. Catherine and I are justly very proud of the things that our organizations do individually, but I think what we've also realized is that it's only when we work collaboratively that we can really maximize our impact, because even though the Red Cross is one of the largest voluntary organizations in the country, in actual fact the scale of our operations in relation to the scale of need is small, and it's only when we work with others. And we have therefore learned a lot about mobilizing with others. We developed a new hardship fund, which has provided around £3 million of support to 12,000 of the most vulnerable people in the country with no income, no savings, no recourse to public funds. But the thing about that money and the identification of the people who provide support is that we've worked with 300 organizations, both local organizations and household names like Bernardo's or Centrepoint or Shelter, to actually identify who those people are and create new referral mechanisms to enable them to get help that is digitally enabled, a digital card that helps them access basic income to pay for food, to pay their rent, or whatever it is their priority is. But we've only been able to do that because we've worked collaboratively. And we've also worked collaboratively as part of an emergency partnership that I co-chair with the chief executive of the umbrella body for small organizations, NAVCA. So we've got 30 to 40 national organizations and 200 local organizations coming together to coordinate the way in which we provide response to people in need through COVID. And that will continue after COVID, because we established it out of the learning from events like the Grenfell Tower fire about the need to work together and the recognition that we're an ecosystem. This doesn't lend itself to command and control. It's not typical emergency services type work, but it's only when we have these connected models that mean that the smallest of local specialist organizations are connected into more significant or larger national organizations that have resources, that the whole comes together. And that means that we can learn more from what the situation is on the ground, that we can direct resources to where they're most needed, but we can also be a more effective partner to government, both locally and nationally, because we make it easier to interact with us, because we have people that they can actually talk to, and therefore build a picture of the ways in which we can move forwards together. But it's really making sense of an ecosystem in which the right things are more likely to happen. And the third key area that I'd highlight is around innovation. Catherine talked very eloquently about the surge in volunteering. And there is an elasticity to volunteering and indeed to giving that we see, because when there is a big international emergency, no matter what the level of compassion fatigue there may be, you see a surge in giving, but it comes to an end. And the question is, how do you, as Catherine described, nurture relationships, be it with donors or with volunteers, of people who've shown their humanity to want to be able to continue? And we've had to replace around £30 million of income from shops that had to close, our first aid training, social enterprise, some of our community fundraising, through alternative ways of funding, and innovating through fundraising through TikTok, through reaching a younger audience and showing that they actually are willing to give. We set up a new fundraising program with 3,000 gamers who are stuck at home to create an opportunity for them to give. But then partnerships with people like PPL are so important, because what PPL enable is it's neither fully restricted funds or fully general funds, but it's steered in a certain direction towards an area where we agree with PPL that we want to have some impact, be it around the improving the outcomes for refugees and asylum seekers, or be it through our community engagement, both here in the UK and around the world. And it's that kind of steered flexibility that makes it possible, but combined with innovation in what we do, but also the ways in which we do it and fundraise for it. And the call, the ambitious call that I would like to make, and I don't know whether it rises to Tim's challenge or not, but is, I think the government has just published the integrated review about Global Britain as a force for good, but it also includes a section on developing a national resilience strategy here in the UK. And I think the civil society strategy, or the strategy we have for civil society, should be the mirror image of that national resilience strategy, because it is civil society that enables people to be more resilient, better able to cope with an emergency or a crisis when something happens, but also better able to respond when it does happen. And I think if we should invest in civil society as part of building our national resilience. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you, Mike. So before we move on to Malcolm, I'd just like to mention that questions can be submitted to us by clicking on the Q&A button in the CP platform, or you can click the question link below the YouTube stream. So Malcolm, eager to hear your thoughts. Malcolm, you are on mute, I think.
Is that me now?
Can hear you now, thank you.
Great. Yes, thanks, Phoebe, and good afternoon, everyone. People's Postcode Lottery are very pleased to be partnering with Bright Blue to hold this event and to make sure that the voice of charities is heard at the Conservative Spring Forum. We have had an exhibition stand and held fringe events at Conservative Conference for several years now, and we always get a lot of engagement from delegates. And I'm always struck at those events how many delegates are actually also players of People's Postcode Lottery. So, and a special thank you to anyone watching who's a player, because it was your involvement, of course, which raises the funds which help us support so many charities. And basically, by doing that, you're making a difference in hundreds of different ways every day for your subscription. And with over 4 million players now, it is a collective effort, which is a huge impact. Now, politics tends to highlight differences, but one other observation from attending not just Conservative conference in the past, but all the other party conferences as well, is that a great many political activists and party members are also deeply involved in their communities in many different ways, and that includes volunteering with charities and community groups, or indeed being involved in the running of those organisations. So it's sort of the focus on the community is very appropriate. And as a charity fundraiser and funder, People's Postcode Lottery works closely with charities every day of the year, and part of the model of the organisation is to have a strong ongoing relationship with charities. And that's been even more been the case over the last year, which has brought so many challenges for everyone. Our founders were themselves charity fundraisers and thus knew many of the issues facing charities in regard to raising funds, and sought to build a funding model which puts the charities first as opposed to the needs of the funder first. And that manifests itself in various ways. As Mike was saying, the funding is largely unrestricted, although obviously all the due diligence checks are done, etc. And then we trust the charities we work with that they know how best to spend the funds as they're working on the front line every day, and are therefore the experts on how best to support their beneficiaries. I think that's an interesting model which perhaps links to some of what Tim was saying about how the government can work with the third sector in a perhaps more trusting way, because we know that organisations like RVS and the Red Cross very much know what they're doing, and it's trusting them that we trust them that they know best to get the job done. Much of the funding is also multi-year ongoing funding, allowing charities to plan ahead and put the resources in place to do the work they need to do, and with the knowledge that the funding will be there year on year. But the last year has seen very obvious strains on charities and charity fundraising, with some types of fundraising more difficult or impossible than before, for example, events fundraising or charity shops, as Catherine mentioned. At the same time, it's been a year where the charity sector has stepped forward and stepped up in a huge number of ways to help our communities. Now, thanks to our model of funding via charity lotteries, it's actually been remarkably resilient throughout the pandemic, which has been great. We were worried at the start, but actually, it's been very, very resilient and enabled us to support charities large and small, and as well as larger charities like the Red Cross and RVS. We also fund thousands of small community charities across the country. And at the start of the pandemic, we contacted all of those charities to say to them that if they needed to change their plans for how they were to spend their funding, they should do, and we would support them in that. And our players have also provided an extra 4 million of funding for community charities to help with COVID recovery. And that was the second half of last year. But actually, in that funding round, we were able to fund 4 million, but we had actually applications worth 51 million from over 4,000 organisations. So that just gives you a level of the need and demand that is out there amongst the charity sector. In addition, we've also supported about 60 larger charities with extra funding, and are just announcing further support through the COVID Recovery Fund that we're running. Now, where does government come into all of this? From our point of view, just by a coincidence, really, the government actually changed the law on charity lotteries just as we went into lockdown in March last year, further to a campaign supported by many Conservative MPs and peers, as well as MPs across the party. And that was to basically reduce some of the bureaucracy and red tape around running charity lotteries, which are highly regulated. And as a result of those reforms, we've been able to do more just when we needed to do more. And that has included doubling this year, 2021, doubling the funding to small charities from over 8 million to over 17 million. And actually also from June, the percentage charity contribution from every subscription will increase to 33% for every ticket, which is great news. Again, will mean more funds year on year for the charities to support. So I'd certainly want to thank the ministers at DCMS for getting those reforms through, even if they haven't gone quite as far as we would like them to. And I know that we'll be assessing the impact of the reforms in the summer before considering next steps. But I do hope they continue to go ahead with reforms and complete that reform process, because they allow charity lotteries like People's Postcode Lottery to cut admin and bureaucracy and do more for local and national charities, where we have heard there's continued to be huge demand for funds to help support our communities. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Malcolm. So before we move on to audience questions, I have some questions of my own. So I think I'd like to direct this to Catherine first. So Tim spoke about a recycling of personnel between Whitehall, government and the third sector. Is this a phenomenon you recognise, Catherine? And do you agree that the voluntary sector is too close to the state?
Thanks, Tim.
Sorry.
No, okay. So I'm very clear that the roots, the evolution of the charity sector, it was set up to complement the state. And I think that distance changes hugely over various decades. So if you go back 3 decades, the sector was very, very distinct from the state. And then we went through public service reform, where everybody wanted, charity sector to deliver public service contracts. And actually, as Mike mentioned as well, the thing is if you need the money and you want to deliver the services to vulnerable people, and that is where the money's coming from, you end up being attracted much closer to the state, and you have a very different relationship with the state than if you are independent of it. So I think that distance between the charity sector and the state changes on an ongoing basis. I guess where we are at the moment, I mean, I feel like I am inside the NHS rather than working alongside the NHS, because obviously we have been on the front line, and that is right for this period of time. But actually we will all, as large scale charities, want to reset the relationships. And that's why we have to have this very keen eye on what is coming next. What is recovery going to look like? Where are our services? Where are our complementary nature of the things that we are able to do? So for Royal Voluntary Service, I'm looking at the prevention end and at the recovery end. And therefore, it's not about being inside hospital, carrying on delivering injections and all of that. It's about how do we prevent vulnerable people from ending up needing, sickness services or ability to be able to, be in work and live fulfilled lives. How do we focus on that? And then how in the recovery do we play forward all of this, massive people force that we now have, who are connected to their communities, who want to support people to recover from the very, very, very serious exacerbation of the health inequalities. I used to run an arm's length body, and at one point for government, and at one point it sounded almost like Tim, to throw it back to Tim, was actually describing the Quangos, the arm's length bodies, because I was around when those were set up. And actually those were sort of the underpinning principles of having something that sat between the charity sector and the state. But I think we all know what happened with those. So we need to reset and rethink the relationships, as Danny said. It's a great opportunity. Let's not waste the crisis.
Fantastic. Thank you, Catherine.
Can I just respond just quickly?
Yeah, of course.
What I'm not doing in describing this phenomenon is blaming the voluntary sector, just to be clear.
I know.
It's the nature of the funding settlement that forces, you groups to behave in a certain way. Yep. And you're obviously right about the Quangos as well. They didn't have the kind of performance or community measurement or other thing that I would say we need. And I don't think that my sort of system of graduation is necessarily the way or the only way. I think we just need, I was interested in your response and grateful for it actually, because I don't think you didn't say it wasn't real to some extent, although perhaps you don't think it as real as worry about it as much as I do. But I think there should at least be, we don't have to do it in a big bang way, but if we use this opportunity to experiment much more with how we could try and address this problem, I think that would be good, because groupthink is a massive problem in almost every sector, and we don't need that in the sector which is so important in helping our most vulnerable people and so many of the most acute problems.
I do agree with that, Tim. The groupthink stuff is absolutely essential, and it's not by sector, it's cross sector.
Yeah.
Thank you both. So Danny, I have two questions for you. First of all, you've recently started a new project called the New Social Covenant, which aims to sustain the spirit of national unity that we saw at the height of the pandemic. Could you be explicit about what role for charities you foresee in that? And then also we have, there's been some discussion around charity lotteries during this panel, and the review of the Gambling Act is due this year. And there's been some concerns from the third sector that the review may not differentiate as much as it maybe should or could between traditional, more harmful types of gambling and socially beneficial types such as the charity lotteries. So are those fears legitimate in the third sector, or will the review take that into account? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, on that second point, I don't know. I recognise that anxiety, and I think that it's well made. And I'd be happy to try and make those representations along with colleagues from the sector if that would help, because I think that it is important to preserve the role of the lotteries. I mean, I think there's a big question to be asked about the future of lotteries, and particularly the National Lottery, about how it works. But it would be a shame to lose that income. On your more general point, I mean, so thank you. My new unit I've set up with my colleague Miriam Cates MP is intended to try and reach towards a better settlement at all levels, actually, post-Brexit, post-COVID. How do we build a more sustainable, more local, more social, and more human economy? And that includes an element of public service reform. I, as I hope I've made clear, think there's a central role for charities, civil society, voluntary sector, mutuals, co-ops, social enterprises, this whole social economy, which has been so strong and so resilient during this crisis, as well as under such extreme pressure. So I think that the new model we are reaching towards will give a central role to this sector. I think we do need to think about a new version of, we need a new chapter in this story that we've just been discussing, that Tim and Catherine were just discussing about over the last 30 years, we have developed, I think, a ultimately unsatisfactory, rather instrumental relationship between civil society and the state, whereby we try to bring charities into the mainstream of public service delivery, but we effectively force them into a sort of unhappy hybrid paradigm of where partly they're basically state agents of the state with the same bureaucracies and the same inflexibilities, because they're delivering statutory services, and we force them to operate rather like commercial businesses on a competitive basis with an attitude around unit costs and best values. And actually we need neither of those things, or rather we need less of them and more of the third thing, which is the human qualities of our sector. And in the civil society strategy, which the government published a couple of years ago, which I had a hand in when I was a civil servant, I am that revolving door person that I'm concerned about, by the way. I've been a politician, civil servant, charity chief executive.
Out.
But I am a conservative, so it's okay. But in the civil society strategy the government published, we talked about collaborative commissioning, which is a better model, rather than the state designing a service it wants, in a very kind of statutory way, and then contracting it out in a kind of commercial way, and then charities having to slightly adapt to both the commercial and the statutory elements of this service, this contract. The charity should be in at the beginning, helping design that service, working with commissioners, and bringing in its own assets. Additional funding can bring, but also the expertise and the connection with the communities that are going to be served. So I think we can develop a better model that preserves the value of the sector, while also making sure it's mainstream, part of the general economy of public services, and has some of those business-like elements that we need. They have to be competitive, they have to be good value, they have to be accountable and dynamic. So we, slightly cakeist approach, but I think we can have it all if we think about it in those terms.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, we're getting some questions through from the audience, which is brilliant. And just to remind everyone, you can ask questions via the CP platform by clicking on the Q&A, and you can also do so by submitting them through Slido if you're watching this stream via YouTube. So, question from Jim Crawley: how can we foster a greater volunteering culture after COVID so that many more people will continue to support their local communities? Should people get more time off? So, asking for some concrete policy ideas to support this new force of volunteers that we have. Catherine, would you like to come in on that?
Yes, thank you. A beautiful question for me. Thank you very much. So I think it's about articulating what we require people to do. So one of the big learnings from the pandemic is that when you are very clear about what the opportunity is, how you can volunteer, how you get there. We've used digital tech as well in a way that's never been used before. And allow people to choose when they want to volunteer by turning on an app, rather than you've got to volunteer on Wednesday between 10 and 12 or Friday between 2 and 6. It allows people to the point earlier about democratizing, it allows people to choose when they want to volunteer, and understand what it is that they can do and the benefit that will bring. So I think, one, we've got to be very clear. I think secondly, we need to understand that actually volunteers are not free. They're not free labour. They're part of a blended workforce, a people workforce, however you want to describe it. And therefore recruiting, retaining, training and supporting has all got to be part of the rich sort of back office of how we support people then. And then, we also need to be more agile. A project that Mike and I are doing with St John's is to look at how our three organisations might be able to help our volunteers to move around between our three organisations as a starter for 10. Because whilst I absolutely subscribe to people wanting to belong, actually people volunteer because they are connected to the cause. They want to make a difference for the cause. So from Royal Voluntary Services perspective, I don't have to have them as an RVS volunteer, sort of quite traditionally old school. I want them to broker, to connect them, and then let them do their best work. Trust them to do their best work. We don't need volunteers to jump through the same hoops over and over again. Some volunteers have got 20 DBS checks. They've done the same, level 2 food handling or hygiene course 13 times, because they happen to want to volunteer for more than one organisation or in more than one setting. So actually the systems have got to get more coordinated, and we've got to trust each other's systems to be able to help volunteers move around and do their best work.
Fantastic, thank you, Catherine. So I just have a question actually about smaller charities. I mean, Mike, you've spoken about difficulties in funding, and of course we've also seen that many charities have responded to COVID-19 by moving what they can online, setting up remote services. That might not be as possible or sustainable for smaller charities, which can of course be really crucial to supporting their local communities. What sort of support do you think we need to have in place in the future during, other national crises that we may have for these types of charities?
Well, I think it's all about connectedness and into those organisations. So I mentioned the emergency partnership that we have founded with, close to 200 local organisations, and we've done a lot of work trying to understand how we can better connect into the local specialist organisations that maybe focused on people from ethnic minorities or on disability or whatever, or just in a very tight geographical area. And what we're trying to do is to work up, how do we work with those organizations? How do we as a national organization connect with them to enable the whole to be greater than the sum of the parts? And that requires a lot of listening. So we've done a lot of that over the time. You can't escape the need for funding and the ability to innovate and channel funds through to support some of those charities. But I just want to pick up some of what Danny was saying as well. I think actually there's great diversity in the sector. We need efficiency, we need effectiveness, we need to hold on to our humanity, we need to really build in properly evidence around whether we're reaching people in the areas of greatest health inequality. We definitely need tools like collaborative commissioning. But there's two then additional asks. I think government has to be much more curious about the difference that we as a sector can make systematically by working in the kind of partnership I've described of national and local. And then secondly, we as a sector have to recognise that we're quite difficult to engage with. We're so diffuse and diverse that actually government, we don't make it easy. And so coming together into the kind of partnerships I've described is an attempt to make it easier for government to engage. And the other ask of government would be, when we talk about volunteers, not only are they very professional in the kind of ways that Catherine's described, then it's not a question of use a volunteer, use an amateur. These are really well-skilled, qualified people. But you can't have systematic volunteering at scale without some organizations that are ready to manage, to support, to train, to recruit, to thank them in the kind of ways both small organizations and do. So when we think about volunteering, it's not only not free, but you need some organizations that can provide the support to those people to be able to mobilize them.
Fantastic, thank you, Mike. I have a question I think Tim would be well placed to answer from an anonymous person who says that Robert Putnam says that there's been a trend in increasing charity numbers in the US over the last century because charities there are becoming smaller and more professionalized and more focused on campaigning. Is that happening in the UK, and is it a problem?
I think it is happening. I think the general problem we have in lots of walks of life now is politics is just too dominant. And I think the British state is a particularly centralized form of state. And Danny is one of the most important members of Parliament at the moment. He's a friend, and I'm going to creep around him, but his agenda is so important, and it greatly frustrates me that the Conservative Party more generally isn't embracing it enough, because we, at our core, we should be a party that doesn't believe that all eggs should be in one basket. Even when we have won the general election, we should be willing to let all sorts of other experiments happen in the rest of society. Some of them done by our political opponents, but also some of them done by voluntary organisations, a whole range of institutions. And that is what traditionally Conservatives have been good at, building institutions. And we must do that again. And there must be a sort of, one of the reasons why I feel most passionately, the reason I got into being interested in the subject, my background is the church. I have seen so many church charities in particular lose completely what made them a success once taxpayers' money touched them. They became bureaucratized, and the holistic care that they gave to people was really lost. And we all lost because of that. But the state struggles to be willing to endorse a church because it thinks it's endorsing religion. What we've got to get away from is the idea that the money that the state is doling out is the state's money. It's not the state's money, it's all of our money. It's money that is owned by that church group, by that mosque, by that radical queer rights group in a different part of Britain. We've got to be willing to accept that people as citizens of this country have a right to a certain share of funds to use for their communities, geographical or otherwise, in the way that they see fit. Fantastic,
thank you, Tim. So I think we'll go to our final question now, which I'll direct to Malcolm. Just a very simple question. Has COVID-19 permanently changed the way charities fundraise? And what does that really look like?
Well, I think it certainly highlighted various sort of issues and problems. And I think, you know, going forward, how do we build on making the funding base of charities more resilient, both large and small charities. Just sort of touching on some of what Mike said and the question on small charities, one of the things we've been looking at doing is, you know, how can we take some of the lessons from the funding that we've given to larger charities like RVS and the Red Cross, such like, you know, largely unrestricted funding, you know, multi-year funding, and make that also applicable to smaller charities, because smaller community charities do amazing work. In the past, you know, perhaps there's, you know, concerns that, you know, people might get things wrong or not do things quite right. But well, if you're funding thousands of charities and a couple of them get something wrong,
exactly,
yeah. What, you know, you want to make, you know, they would get the benefit of all those that are doing things right. And so sometimes it's quite basic things make a huge difference. Like we've now started, for example, funding the core costs of small charities. It's not just project funding, it's also core cost funding. And that's absolutely crucial for small organizations which largely struggle to get core costs funded. It can actually be transformational because they don't have to suddenly worry about, you know, their basic things which are really hard, traditionally very hard to fundraise for. But also, you know, most small volunteer-run charities or charities with a couple of staff don't employ professional fundraisers. So being able to, you know, have a sort of funding process for them which is relatively light touch and not involving huge numbers of forums and etc. before they can get, you know, access to funds, I think is also really important. So some of this is not rocket science, it's just actually just trying to work out a system that works for the organizations we're trying to support, and as I said right at the start, being led by the needs of the charity groups as opposed to by the needs of the government.
Fantastic, thank you, Malcolm. I've actually just been told that we do have time for one more question, which I'm going to direct to Danny. This is an audience question. So Gareth Williams asks, is the government looking at your volunteer passport system? He says that in Buckinghamshire, we had 1,800 volunteers during COVID. It would be really great to get the system into other areas.
Thanks a lot. Yes, they are. So DCMS are thinking hard about this, and I very much echo what Catherine said earlier about the real driving need now to regularise the system of volunteering so that people are not having to jump through loads of hoops and get loads of DBS checks and take the same, you know, health and safety courses or whatever it is all the time. We need a more mobile volunteering population. We've got a real problem of supply and demand. Lots of people wanted to volunteer, as we've seen. Amazing supply of volunteers, but then loads of vacancies in our society, including quite serious roles that I think should be filled, like magistrates and school governors and scout leaders and special constables, all these amazing roles which, you know, we could fill, but we just need to fix supply and demand better. And I think a volunteer passport's the way to do that. So yes, they are looking at that. The fact, the difficulty is loads of places are developing their own models, and there is a big danger, I think, of big government coming in and building some vast database that doesn't really work and that people don't want to play part of. So it's got to be, to Catherine endorsing that, and Mike and I have spoken about it before as well. You know, the civil society itself can develop this system in a more bottom-up way, working with government. So it's not a straightforward process, and we certainly don't want government to take over. But government should embrace this principle and work with the sectors to develop it, in my view.
Thank you very much, Danny. Well, that is our time. I think what has clearly emerged is that COVID has very much created the space and appetite for change, for policy innovation, perhaps particularly in terms of volunteers. Many thanks to our panelists, to the audience for joining us and sending through so many questions, and to the People's Postcode Lottery for partnering with us on this event, for which we are very grateful.
Thank you.
Thank you.